Father Jose Luis Sanchez is thanking you for being with us today, and he sends Cardinal Antonio Cañizares regards, who asked him to say hello for him.
Good. Thank you.
He's now mentioning that you have been very near the University of Valencia, the Catholic University of Valencia, and that you have been helping and cooperating with them, taking part in some of the first and second international conferences on famine and poverty in the world. And now he's mentioning your curriculum, you as a Nobel laureate.
Okay. Am I visible at the moment?
Yes, you are. Yes, okay. You are. You are on screen. He's mentioning your contribution to research, biology, medicine, and for us to be able to understand how hereditary illnesses work, which could be a result of genetic misbehavior. He's also mentioning you're a leader and a world leader, and you have led this campaign, this Nobel campaign about the GMOs to finish famine in the world. We have worked on his papers in about this issue and have made them visible with the aim of people to be able to eat better thanks to your cooperation. This new kind of food can cooperate, can help productivity, food productivity, and eliminate famine in the world. Probably these food are safer than traditional food because they have been tested widely. Today, we can count on him, and we are closing today's series with your presentation, tackling inequality in a pandemic, with dear Dr. Roberts. You are very beloved, and thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let me share my screen so that you can actually see the slides. And it really is a pleasure to be with you today. I'm sorry that I could not be there in person. I think these Zoom meetings are getting rather old, and we need to do much more in terms of tackling not just inequality, but tackling the pandemic itself and everything that has come as a result of it. I want to cover three main items during this talk. One of those, let me change slides. One of those is directly related to COVID-19, and I will talk a little bit about the availability of tests and vaccines, because this is something that is really very contentious at the moment, in that if you come from a developed country, anywhere in Europe or the US or some other places, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, then everything is widely available. But if you come from the developing world, that is not the case. I will talk about that first, but then I will go on and talk about GMOs. And probably most of my talk will be about GMOs, because this is an area that is just incredibly important for the developing world, not so important for the developed world. Although in Europe, it does appear that finally climate change is having an impact, and meaning that one will need GMOs in order to feed Europe too. So let me start first with COVID-19 and the tests that are available for it. There are basically two kinds of tests, RNA tests and antibody tests. The RNA test look for the actual viral genome, and there is PCR and LAMP. Now, PCR is a way of amplifying the sequence so that it can be detected, but it's actually quite intensive in terms of the reagents and in terms of the equipment that is needed to do it. It is something that is readily available throughout the developed world, but usually only available in somewhat limited areas, mainly in cities in the developing world, and something that is much more difficult to accomplish when you're out in the field. LAMP amplification, on the other hand, is something that does essentially the same thing, but it's isothermal, it doesn't need fancy equipment, and it's something that would lend itself to being used in villages, in small rural communities in the developing world. And it would be good to see more of this being accepted and more of it being made available in the developing world. The antibody tests, on the other hand, detect the presence of the antigen, of the protein that is associated with COVID-19 virus. It's useful to see whether or not you have antibodies against it, but these antibodies can persist long after the actual infection. And so it doesn't always tell you what you would like to know about whether someone is infected or not. Vaccines are really one of the high points of the whole COVID pandemic. Vaccines traditionally have been based upon antigens, in which you try to deliver the antigens through to a person in either an immobilized or an inactivated virus, or on some secondary virus, in order to get the antibody response. These traditional vaccines usually take a long time to develop. They take a long time to test properly, and they are not always as effective as one would like. In fact, as an example, the Chinese antigen-based vaccine was only about 40 to 50% effective. It was not as effective as some of the others. But the great achievement during the last couple of years has been the development of messenger RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines. These are the vaccines that were developed by Moderna and by Pfizer, and they have really revolutionized the way we're starting to think about making vaccines. And the mRNA vaccines have turned out to be incredibly effective, better than 90% immunity being provided by them. Now, they're still at an early stage of development in the sense that they're still quite difficult to make, quite difficult to deliver. And it's hoped, and I think will be achieved, that in the next few years, it will become much easier to make mRNA vaccines and to deliver them. And the beauty of this is that, having seen how effective they are against COVID, they probably will also be terribly effective against other diseases. And so many of the traditional methods of making vaccines are likely to be succeeded by having mRNA vaccines available. And there will be a great deal of work done on this. And the great advantage of that is that as more work is done, as more people learn how to make these, this will be technology that will be available not just in the developed world, which is mainly where they're available at the moment, but also in the developing world. And both Moderna and Pfizer have committed to trying to assist in this, although they've had to have a certain amount of prompting in order to make them do it. But nevertheless, it does look as though they are going to really come through as major vaccines useful against COVID, but also useful against many other diseases. I want to turn now to genetically modified organisms. And I want to start by saying that the term genetically modified organism is pretty misleading. It is not really a good description of the organisms that everybody is worried about when they talk about GMOs. We have to remember that every life form on this planet has been genetically modified by evolution. Evolution continually is modifying the genes present in plants, in animals, in bacteria, in every form of life. And plant breeding, where we've deliberately tried to improve plants and has been practiced for many centuries, it too involves genetic modification. That is, the genes in the plant, in the crop, in whatever we're trying to improve, the genes keep getting modified and keep getting changed. And so it's a little bit hypocritical to really talk about gene modification and GMO as though it is something new. It really isn't. And unfortunately, hypocrisy is something that abounds in the anti-GMO movement. The anti-GMO people have picked specific crops, specific plants, specific kinds of organisms that they are concerned about, and yet they say absolutely nothing about insulin production for diabetics. You know, if you have diabetes, you take human insulin. Where does that human insulin come from? It doesn't come from humans. Rather, it comes from a genetically modified bacterium or yeast that produces human insulin. So why aren't the anti-GMO people concerned about that? Well, of course, the answer is it's because it's a pharmaceutical, and they don't really care so much to try and stop pharmaceuticals, with one exception, which I will come to in a moment. You also have to ask, why have they accepted these vaccines for COVID-19 within 12 months of development? These are all made from genetically modified organisms. Why is that not a problem? Well, again, it's because it's a pharmaceutical, and they don't want to classify themselves as being against improved pharmaceuticals. But perhaps one of the biggest problems that I have is to ask, why do they allow millions of tons of GMO products to be imported into Europe and used to feed animals for human consumption? If GMOs are so terrible and so awful, why are they importing all of these to feed the animals that they're then going to eat? Well, of course, the answer is because their anti-GMO campaign is really about raising money and gaining political power and doing things that really have nothing to do with helping to improve the human condition. I'd like to just step back for a moment and talk about the discovery of the GMO method, the way in which genes are transferred into plants. And this was due to the work of Mark van Montague and Jeff Schell working in Belgium, and then also Mary Del Chilton working independently in Washington. What they discovered was that there was a way by which a natural bacterium, in this case, Agrobacterium tumefaciens on the right, is able to transfer its DNA into plants. Now let's first look at conventional breeding on the left, the way in which breeders, plant breeders, improve crops. They do so by taking an elite variety, shown on the left, crossing it with a related variety that has a desired trait. Maybe what they want a corn to grow taller, to produce more seeds. So they take a related variety and try to make a cross between them in much the way that humans make babies. They make the cross, and the first hybrid that is produced has a mix 50% of genes from the elite variety and 50% from the one with the desired trait. They will then look at many of these hybrids, pick the one that they think is most suitable, and then cross it back with the elite variety and repeat the process. And the second generation of hybrid will have 25% of its genes from the related variety with the desired trait, but 75% from the elite variety. And they continue doing this to get rid of as many of the undesired genes from the related variety as they possibly can. But usually they don't get rid of all of them, but they get rid of most of them. And in this way, they end up with a desired variety that has the trait that they were breeding for. Now, sometimes that doesn't work. And what happens then is that they will often mutagenize the plants. They will use radiation or they'll use chemicals to induce mutations in the genes in the hope that they can get the trait they want. This is all considered very safe, according to Greenpeace. And the reason they think it's safe is because we've been doing it for so long that it's become more or less traditional practice and quite accepted. But precision breeding, which is the result of the GMO method, in which you precisely move the gene that you want into the elite variety using Agrobacterium tumefaciens, this they consider very dangerous, even though, however you look at it, it is much simpler to produce. You know exactly what you're doing. You can check if the gene you want has gone into the plant and see exactly where it's gone. But this is dangerous. And it's dangerous on the basis of it being something that is viewed as not natural. If it's just the TI plasmid from Agrobacterium tumefaciens, they think that's okay, because that is natural. But then if you put another gene in, one that you think the plant would benefit from, then all of a sudden that becomes very dangerous. And this is the basis of the GMO method. It's the basis for how we are now able to precisely breed plants and animals and other things using a process that was essentially natural in the first place, but has been demonized by Greenpeace as being very dangerous. I want to give you an example of what we're thinking about here. So if we want to move a gene from one place to another, the same analogy is to say, well, I want to move a GPS system from my old car into my new one. Should I really disassemble the two cars, mix up all the parts, and then select the one with the GPS in it, ignoring what else might have come? Perhaps it picked up a different carburetor, perhaps a different engine. Or should I just take the GPS from one car and move it to the other? Well, the top is the traditional method of making changes in plants, and the bottom is the GMO method. That is, it has a precision associated with it that we know which GPS moves from one car to another, or which gene moves from one place to another. The anti-GMO activists would have you believe that the latter, the single gene movement from one place to another, is bad. Often they will also tell you that if I were to take a GPS from an airplane, that the new car is now going to fly. Well, of course, the gene, the GPS, has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the airplane can fly. It has to do with the positioning of the airplane and being able to know exactly where it is. And you will often hear from the anti-GMO activists that it is really very dangerous to take a gene from, say, a salmon and put it into a plant. Perhaps they won't quite tell you that the plant will now be able to swim, but somehow they will convince you that it's very dangerous. And I think this is really not good. This is not a good way to be dealing with things. And you have to remember that genetic modification, however it's carried out, refers to a method. It's a way of doing something. But what's important is the product. It's what comes out at the far end that is important, not the method by which it got there. And this is just as true for traditional breeding, which we consider so safe. And I think we have to remember that within the context of this conference, that it is the 800 million who go to bed hungry every night who we need to deal with. Food is medicine for them. If they don't get enough food, they really can't live. Now, back in about 5-6 years ago now, I started a movement among the Nobel laureates to ask them how they felt about GMO technology, and in particular, to support GMO technology, which every scientist knows is basically very safe. We now have 158 Nobel laureates who've supported an open letter that went to Greenpeace and to every UN ambassador, urging an acknowledgement that GMO technology is basically safe. And it should be supported for the sake of the developing world. And I particularly like this cartoon on the right, which came from a cartoonist in Iowa, who shows on the left the anti-GMO people in cartoon fashion, telling a young boy in Africa, do you know what this stuff can do to you? And of course, the young boy says, yes, I know it can help keep me alive. And I think this is the message that I'm hoping to leave you with, that this GMO technology is going to be the lifesaver for the developing world. They need more food. The population in Africa in particular is growing very rapidly. And the only way they're going to provide the food that's needed is by using GMO technology to improve current crops. Now, the origins of the anti-GMO movement are something which is worth thinking about. Africa, South America, Asia, they all need better crops with higher yields, and they need the products of precision breeding. But Europe doesn't. And the reason Europe doesn't is because almost all of the time and money have gone into improving crops that are eaten in North America, in Japan, in Europe, crops that are not necessarily the ones that are eaten in the rest of the world, in the developing world. And so all of the crops that are currently grown in Spain, Europe, the US, they've all been improved to a point where they produce very good yields. But most of the crops that are needed and eaten in the developing world are different, and they have never been improved. There have not been attempts made to greatly improve either their yield, their flavor, their nutritional value, because there was never seen to be any money in this. Now, the Europeans know perfectly well that this is the case, that it is the developing world that is going to benefit from GMO crops, but they don't need it. So why don't they endorse it? Why wouldn't the Europeans want to endorse this technology, which can help the developing world? And of course, the answer always comes as a result of this question: could it be politics or money or both? Well, in this case, it was both. The Europeans didn't want US companies to control their food. And so how can that be prevented? Well, they could ban at the time Monsanto, now Bayer, and other big US agribusinesses from selling plant crops to them, from selling the seeds, from selling the plants. But the problem with that is that the farmers buy their seeds from them. And the idea of banning Monsanto, which was the first company to try to introduce GM modified crops into Europe, they became an instant target. And they were already a bit of a target from the European standpoint because of this thought that the US were going to control the food supply in Europe. And so the Green parties came up with this wonderful solution. So they can't ban Monsanto because they need most of their products. And so they assert that the GMO method or precision breeding might be dangerous. And the politicians and the Green parties will protect you from this risk by banning GMOs. And best of all, this has absolutely no economic consequences for Europe, but it turned out to have wonderful economic consequences for Greenpeace. So this was where everything came from. And as soon as you assert that something might be dangerous, then all you have to do is to go to Hollywood or elsewhere to find out how to make movies, how to make stories that will convince people that these crops are dangerous. And that's precisely what Greenpeace did. They went out of their way to suggest that these crops were inherently very dangerous. In fact, one of the leaders of the anti-GMO movement at the time came up with the name Frankenfoods and claims that these Frankenfoods could be dangerous. Now, the thing that really appalls me about all of this is that when this first happened, Greenpeace and the other anti-GMO parties claimed that they were concerned about the science, that because the science was still very new, we really needed to do more experiments, to spend more time looking at what was going on, to make sure that the GMO process was not inherently dangerous. And they produced leaflets suggesting that this was necessary. But the problem I have is that while at the time, perhaps this was reasonable, it was reasonable to be cautious, 30 odd years later, we now know that the science says these things, GMOs, are perfectly acceptable. They're perfectly safe. There's not been a single problem with them ever since they were first introduced. So Greenpeace, if they're going to follow their original lines of argument that we needed more science, should now come back and look at what the scientists have done and what they found, and finally agree that the evidence is in that these things are not dangerous. Now, I want to take you to a particular case study, which I think is quite interesting. And it concerns the issue of vitamin A deficiency. This is something that we really don't have a problem with in the West because we have foods that have a lot of vitamin A in them, or the precursor to vitamin A, or we can deliver vitamin A in the form of capsules that you might take every day to make sure you get enough. We have many ways of making sure that the populations in the developed world are not vitamin A deficient. But in the developing world, people have a much more restricted diet. They typically don't have access to all of the vitamin supplements that we have here in the US, especially if they live in the rural areas of Africa. And as a result of that, there are somewhere close to 2 million or more vitamin A deficient children are born every year. And this can have severe consequences. It can cause immune problems and it can lead to blindness. If you compare the numbers with those with HIV, with tuberculosis, with malaria, the numbers are really strikingly different. Many, many more people have vitamin A deficiency. And of course, if you're a young child in a rural area in Africa and you go blind, that's really the end of it for you. There just is not the support system to make sure that such children live happily. And that's why the mortality rate is so high. Now, some years ago in 1984, Peter Jennings came up with the idea that maybe if one could put the gene for beta carotene, which is the precursor of vitamin A, if you could put that into rice so that the grain of rice would now provide the vitamin A that children needed in order to get a sufficient dose and avoid deficiency, this would be a good idea. And that was brought to fruition by Ingo Petraikas at the ETH in Zurich and Peter Bayer at the University of Freiburg. And they developed a golden rice back in 1999. That is 23 years ago. Normally, when you produce a variety that is ready to go into commercial production, you typically begin improving the rice, in this case, and so that within 2 to 5 years, it would be necessary and capable of commercial production in the field. But it's a GMO. And only 3 months ago did it become available for commercial production in the Philippines. And now they are starting to grow it in sufficiently large quantities that golden rice will soon be available to everybody in the Philippines. And the multiple years of delay were due to regulation and opposition. And in fact, Greenpeace chose this almost as their poster child to try to stop GMOs. And they produced a little leaflet called Golden Illusion, pretending that because it was taking such a long time to produce it, that it couldn't work very well. And they came out with all sorts of numbers and all sorts of reasons why it shouldn't be developed and why it shouldn't be accepted by the population. But fortunately, the government of the Philippines came to the good conclusion that in fact, GMO rice, golden rice, is safe. It's been approved to be safe in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia. Everybody in those countries has agreed that it's okay. They don't need it, but they've agreed that it's perfectly safe. But in the Philippines, it now is going into commercial production. And we hope soon that there will be other countries that also pick up on it, especially Bangladesh, which is very, very close to approving it also. Now, we need to remember that food choice is a luxury of the developed world. When you go into the supermarket, you have a vast choice of food to pick from. And if you don't want to eat foods that have been derived by GM techniques, then don't. It's your choice. But please, please do not pretend that such foods are dangerous and this is why you don't want to buy them, because they are not. There is no indication whatsoever that they're dangerous, not a single accident that can be shown to be caused by a food developed by GM techniques. And if anything, they're probably safer than traditional foods. And this is because when traditional foods are made, there are many genes that get picked up during breeding that we don't know what they are, and we don't know what they do. And so in the case of GM foods, we know exactly what gene we have put into the plant in order to improve it. So science facts, we see developed countries, food is not a problem. I think, if anything, the only problems that we face in developed countries from foods are that we don't always distribute them very well to the poorer members of our societies. But there really is no reason why food should ever be a problem in the developed world. There is plenty of it. In fact, we throw huge amounts away. But we must never forget the consequences of our actions and our statements for developing countries. So as soon as Greenpeace came out and claimed they didn't want GMOs in Europe and these things were dangerous and should not be allowed there, of course, the developing world picked up on this too. Even worse, Greenpeace sent activists out into the developing world to try to stop governments from approving GM foods. And they've been remarkably successful, and I would say disappointingly successful. Only in a few countries have they actually accepted GM crops in order to improve the food supply. South Africa, for instance, grows something called BT corn, BT maize, in which a bacterial gene for Bacillus thuringiensis toxin has been introduced into the corn, and this kills the insects that try to eat it. So instead of spraying the crops to kill the insects, the plants themselves make the insecticide and protect themselves in that way. This saved the maize crop in the US, in the southern part of the US many years ago, and is now saving the crop in South Africa. And other countries in Africa are looking at this and thinking that they too would like to be growing BT corn. And I think one of the things that we definitely need more of is we need more science in politics. We need the politicians to listen to the scientists, to learn enough so that they can understand the science. And we need a lot less politics in science, but that's really a separate issue. It's really making sure that the politicians listen to the scientists and not the activists. Civil society can also play a role here. So for instance, the major religious leaders should speak out, not just about GMOs, but also about vaccines, because I've been hearing recently, there are some religious leaders who have now become opposed to vaccines. That just makes no sense whatsoever. And perhaps they too need to listen to the scientists. Groups such as the Rotary Clubs, which are available around the world where small businesses help their local communities, they should speak out. And they, on the whole, have been very supportive of GM methods and GM approaches. Influential celebrities, football stars, for instance, should speak out. They too have many followers who will listen to what they say. They should speak out, again, not just for GMOs, but also for vaccines. And finally, the media. It is really very important that they present science facts and not science fiction, so that when they're talking about a particular science fact and looking for scientists to present the facts and to tell their viewers and listeners what's going on, they should really focus on the consensus among scientists and not always present every issue as if it's a 50-50 debate between people who support an issue and people who don't. And this is particularly true for GMOs. The anti-GMO activists should not be given the same amount of time as scientists who talk facts about GMOs. Here's some important numbers about GMOs and their impact. So for instance, in the US, there has been a 37% decrease in pesticide use thanks to the use of GM foods, GM crops. There's been a 22% increase in crop yields. And here's something that's all very disappointing. There are 27 million tons of GM soy imported into the European Union every year. This is to feed sheep, to feed cows and horses and so on. And I'm wondering, when Greenpeace were going after GM foods, why were the animal activists not also going after them? If GM foods are so dangerous, why do they allow them to be fed to sheep and cows and so on? But the number I like best of all is the bottom one, and this is 0. This is the problems that have been scientifically attributable to GM crops. Nothing. There's not been a single instance where a GM crop, a GM food has been shown to be dangerous. And the bottom line on all of this is that when you start to think about these issues, have a heart. Non-GMO is a Western indulgence of the rich. If you don't want it, don't buy it. But it really doesn't work for the poor people in Africa who ask, will I eat today? They don't ask, what will I eat today? They don't have the luxury of going to a French restaurant shown in the left picture. They just want to have some food that they will eat. And as I said much earlier, what's important is not the method by which the food is produced, but rather the quality of the food itself. And GMO methodology can make a big difference in improving the yield of crops, in improving their nutritious quality, and in general, making them better for the people who have to consume them. And I like to finally just mention a couple of things here. One is a movie called Food Evolution. It's available by streaming, and it gives you a very good overview of the debate on GMO foods. It was narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a very famous scientist, and it really shows both sides of the argument and does a very good job of showing that the GM approach is both good and also useful. And on the right-hand side is a book by Ed Regis that really talks about the history of golden rice and the difficulty that it experienced as a result of the anti-GMO movement. So I would finish by also saying I would encourage you to go and visit this site, supportprecisionagriculture.org. This is the Nobel laureate site in which you can find the names of all of the Nobel laureates who support GMOs, and also a lot of additional facts about GMOs and about the movement. Many of the lectures that I have given, there are links to them. And there is also the opportunity for you to sign up and join the Nobel laureates in supporting GMOs. I hope that during the course of this talk, you have received a new appreciation of GMOs and that you now will be as supportive as the Nobel laureates. Thank you.
Dr. Richard John Robert.
Dr. Richard John Robert, as always, it's been a huge pleasure to listen to your knowledge and especially your pedagogical way to help us understanding how the vaccines are being a success for humanity. And soon they will help us in many other illnesses, as well as how you have insisted in the importance of the GMOs, because all GMOs have been all genes in every yield has been in change. The same way diabetics need this insulin, which comes from a yeast, and nobody is against it. You have also clarified how activism has fought against those who are the poorest, and those who are in huge need of food. You have made us understand that we need to fight even if you don't need anything, because there are people who need everything. You have also mentioned that 185 Nobelists are supporting these GMOs, which in no case have shown to be dangerous, but all scientific facts show that they are very good. Dr. Roberts, Mr. Marcelo Sanchez Orondo wants to say hello, and then we will ask if anybody wants to ask questions. The Sciences Bishop in the Vatican says hello to you. Dear Dr. Roberts, I had the pleasure to meet you a couple of years ago, I think, when we had this conference about these topics. I just wanted to assure you that the Vatican Academy is in favor of these GMOs, and Pope John Paul said that it was a solution for hunger in humanity. So I would like that everybody in the church would have that same idea, especially those who are working for the World Organization for Food. Your presentation has been very clarifying, also when you talked about hypocrisy, and I liked the example you made. I know Ingo Petrikis, and I know the level of his sufferings in this aspect. So congratulations to you. So now we are opening the possibility of the audience asking questions to Dr. Roberts. I don't know whether you will have the option to ask, to make questions to a Nobelist. So some teachers and students. Dr. Richards, I don't know whether you know that this conference is being followed via streaming in many universities in the world. So now we are opening this question and answer session.
Thank you. Well, I was very pleased to hear that the Vatican is supportive.
Bien, pues, doctor Richard Jover, veo que no se atreven estos profesores.
Dr. Roberts, I see that no one dared to ask you, probably because the importance of vaccines and of GMOs. Oh, yes, there is one question. One student asks a Nobel, a novelist. I'm a student in biotechnology, and I had the pleasure to be in the conference you made a couple of years ago, and you mentioned that there was some kind of advertisement in these countries which was illegal because it was based on false premises, and you talked about several examples. And you said you were fighting against that kind of activism of advertisements. And I would like to ask whether you have been able to just eliminate that kind of strategy, or whether it is still on.
Yes, unfortunately, it falls into the general category of misinformation, which is something that I fear is very prevalent in society, not just in the US and Europe, but around the world, because of Facebook and because of other social media that have made it really easy to sell misinformation, to sell things that are simply not true to many, many people. And the algorithms that, for instance, Facebook and other social media platforms use means that once you accept one piece of misinformation, it is very easy then to spread it further, because you will continue to get more and more misinformation along the same lines. And this is something that I think is dangerous. not just for the GMO movement, but also for the vaccine movement and for many other important social issues that depend on science. Have we been successful? No, I think we have not been successful yet. Ultimately, this is the kind of thing that we need political solutions for. We need better regulation of social media to make sure that misinformation does not come out in the volumes that it does at the moment. And I think politicians themselves are often also a source of misinformation, and they often find it very convenient to tell lies in order to support their candidacy and to try to get people to vote for them. And this, I think, is something that I find very worrying. I think politicians really need to be held to a higher standard in terms of speaking about facts and telling people what is true and not trying to spread misinformation.
¿Alguna pregunta más? De todas las maneras, intentaré.
Apparently there are no more questions, but we will try that all these conclusions appear in the acta and in the conference acta, and we will try to send them around the world so that we can contribute to transmitting this and to cooperate. Francis Collins, whom you know, and who is a member of our academy, mentioned that the worst virus we're suffering nowadays is the misinformation virus, which is intentional. It is done on purpose. Funnily, because of money, so that few use the others, most of the others, to make money. I don't know whether that is your whether that's your opinion as well. Intentionality of misinformation.
Absolutely, there's just no question of it. So politicians use it in order to get elected. Some businessmen use it, and others use it in order to make money in some way. In fact, there is a doctor in Florida who has made a fortune by spreading misinformation about vaccines. And I think this is something that we need to make sure it stops. It is really very destructive for society. And to think of misinformation as a virus, I think is actually quite a good analogy, because that is exactly what it does. It just spreads uncontrollably unless politicians will put in place regulations, and they should do that.
Doctor,
Doctor, just one last question. At the beginning of your communication, you have talked about the work which is being done on vaccines. There are many negationists, many young negationists, about vaccines when we don't have any other way to survive, to get rid of this illness. Would you please insist on the importance of these vaccines to be able to get out of this pandemic situation?
Absolutely. So, you know, vaccines are probably the best medicine that we ever came up with, because vaccines prevent disease. And they prevent the severe complications that can come if you do get a disease. This is why we insist when children, before they go to school, have all of the necessary vaccines to protect against disease of one sort and another. They are easily the most effective medicines we have, and pretty much all of them are very, very safe. Only occasionally does one find an individual who has a severe reaction to a vaccine. They usually find out about it when they're children, when they take the vaccines that are really required before you can go to school. And I think for adults now to claim that the COVID vaccine is dangerous just makes no sense at all. Everybody should get vaccinated unless they have some immunocompromised positions that would make it not possible for them to be vaccinated. That's a very, very tiny percent of the population. But other than that, there is no good reason not to get vaccinated. All of these people who tell me they have religious objections, I find to be nonsense. The point about vaccination is not only does it protect you, but it protects your friends and your family and everyone you come into contact with, because you are that much less likely to carry the disease and then to pass it on to them. So I would absolutely insist that everybody get vaccinated. Personally, I would mandate it among the population.
Doctor Richard John Robert.
Dr. Roberts, I'm vaccinated. I have taken the vaccine as well. Doctor, how many times how many doses were you given of the vaccine? 2, 3?
Well, so in my case, because I'm a little older, I have had a booster. So I've had 3 doses of the vaccine now. I think I had the Pfizer vaccine, but both Moderna and Pfizer. Yes, you should get the 2 shots that are necessary. And if you're older, you should get a 3rd shot. But I do have a slight problem with the boost in that there are many people who don't need it. And as long as we have people in the developing world who have a shortage of vaccine, I think we should make sure that we make these vaccines much more available in the developing world than we have in the past. We were rather slow to support, say, COVAX and the other organizations that are trying to get the vaccines into the arms of people in the poorer countries.
In Italy, there's been this issue about having children inoculated with the vaccine, and there are children who have been vaccinated but are transmitting the illness without their knowing that they are ill. What do you think? What's your opinion about children getting this vaccine?
Well, I think on the whole, it's very good for children to get it. But I also am a great believer in testing on a regular basis. And I think for children, I would very much advocate getting tested to make sure that you're free of COVID and hence cannot pass it on to your classmates. And this is another area, as I was saying at the start, where we could do a better job in terms of rolling out tests and making easier tests and cheaper tests for people to use.
Querido Richard, es la tercera vez.
Dear Richard, it's the 3rd time that we have been able to connect with you. You're always so kind and generous with us in this university. your translator, and she has helped us to understand what you said, Miss Maria Jesus Frigols, and a nice person who is always ready to help us. Thank you. And I would like the Chancellor of the Pontification Sciences. I'm glad that he's here to help us transmit the ideas not only of a Nobelist, but a man who has this noble heart. An applause to you, Nobelist in medicine in 1993.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope that the next time we meet, it will be in person.
Estaremos encantados de recibirle en Valencia.
We will love to have you in Valencia and at this university, and I expect that the Pontification Academy will get in touch with you so that you can give them some knowledge and make a communication for them. Many thanks for everything, Dr. Roberts. Goodbye. Goodbye.